Morning, everyone, and thank you, Denise, for the very generous introduction. I suppose the most important thing to say is that I have the dubious pleasure of having probably the lowest information density per slide of anything that you're going to see this morning. So I thought I'd set the bar reasonably low in terms of content. But I think that's because so much of the content that you're going to see today is detailed and well-evidenced and important and makes a serious contribution to our understanding of the effectiveness of news brands and of marketing effectiveness generally. But I thought, as the kind of sacrificial victim with no content at the start, it would be worth me starting to talk a little bit about and encourage us to think a little bit about how the context in which we talk about effectiveness has changed. Because to some extent, effectiveness is, in a way, the art of saying the same thing over and over again, backed by evidence about human behaviours that don't necessarily change that fundamentally over time. There has always been a way in which people respond to communications, in which people respond to advertising, and large parts of that are consistent over time. And as effectiveness people, as those of us who care about effectiveness in whatever discipline in this industry we work in, it's very often our job to remind people, to reinforce what it is about communications that makes it effective in the short term and the long term, and to do that with evidence, and to do that with science, and to do that with rigour. But if the world in which we do that, if the context in which we operate change, then as communicators as well as effectiveness people, the way in which we communicate effectiveness needs to change as well. And the change, I suppose, is this, that we are living in an age of what we at Maxus and other agencies, other parts of this business will have similar kind of ways of talking about it. We talk about living in an age of peak complexity, a world where you've got various different models for how communication is delivered to people effectively crashing into each other. Larger, older, more broadcast models, smaller, much more targeted, much more data-enabled, much more digital models. All of these things have to coexist, and that means that we as effectiveness people need to be peacemakers between them. We cannot ignore the new in favour of the old or the old in favour of the new. We need to find ways of seeing through the clutter, finding the simplicity on the far side of the complexity that gets us to more effective advertising strategies, communications plans, media mixes in general, rather than paying all of our attention to things for which we've always had evidence or to things for which there is suddenly a profusion of new data points. Very often when I talk to clients, to advertisers, and to publishers actually about effectiveness, the thing I almost never hear back is, I'm so pleased with the amount of data I've got to play with now. I'm so delighted that there is 1,000 data points for every one that I had 10 years ago. I wake up in the morning and I punch the air with joy that I have this much data pouring into my business through every available orifice. The word I hear most actually is drowning or suffocating or other words like that, and I'm sure you may feel the same, you may well have experienced the same yourself. This sense that we have turned on a tap that we cannot necessarily switch off. That there is information available to us of varying quality, that comes in with varying frequency, but that comes in increasingly fast. That we, as advertisers, as communicators, as publishers, need to be able to deal with. And it creates a condition within which we operate. We have gone, as effectiveness people, from talking in a vacuum to talking in a crowd. And that means that we are now no longer the only people that bring numbers to the party. Numbers are not in short supply. Sense is in short supply, knowledge is in short supply, but metrics themselves are not. And that can lead us to, and I think everybody in the initial video said much the same thing in various perfect ways. It can lead us to a tendency to focus very much on the short term and on those things that give us a sense of immediate response. Someone, I think at Wieden and Kennedy, once called them crack cocaine metrics, which is punchy, but I rather like. I was on a train a few months back, and there was a very small child, must have been sort of 2 or 3, and there was a newspaper it was one of those train seats with a table, and there was a newspaper that Dad was reading. And this child kept leaning over to the newspaper and trying to swipe it. And was kind of annoyed that this thing was clearly broken because it wouldn't swipe. And expected a newspaper to behave in much the same way that an iPad was. And in ways we can become similar to that. We can look for immediate response. We can look for the ability to swipe the newspaper, so to speak, without necessarily thinking about the context of what we're doing and why we're doing it. But I think I said up front, and I think it's important, that we need to think about effectiveness as communicators as well as analysts, and it's about bringing those two disciplines together and understanding that we operate in a different context now. A context in which, for good or ill, over the last 10 years or so, the focus not just of measurement and of analytics or even of advertising, but of businesses to a large extent, has trended towards the short term. One in which short-term returns have been privileged, focused upon, sweated very, very hard. We live in a world where there are not only algorithms that decide which ads we see, there are algorithms which decide which stocks go up and go down. A lot of these investment decisions are made in the blink of an eye, let alone advertising decisions being made in the blink of an eye. And so it's not surprising that short-termism becomes endemic. And so there's only so much time you can spend telling people that they shouldn't think in a short-term way when everything about the business that they operate in is geared towards operating in the short term. It's still worth saying, it's still worth reinforcing, but we need to think about how we deal with short-termism as opposed to wishing it were going away. We're not going to get back to a situation where we suddenly find ourselves with 3 months or a year to evaluate the effectiveness of a campaign and the luxury of being able to say nothing about that campaign while it's running. We need to find a way of balancing those two imperatives, of dealing with the fact that the short term is here for the long term, and that we're being encouraged to say something meaningful about campaign effectiveness fairly early on in the life cycle of our communications. And the challenge is not between saying something meaningful and saying nothing at all, it's between saying something meaningful and saying something meaningless, and of simply reporting metrics because they're fast. So the reason a lot of the work you'll see today is important and powerful is because it helps us to bridge a bit of this gap, helps us to see slightly past the gulf between short and long term and to reconcile some of these kind of differences. If I could put it very simply, I think what the important priority is for those of us who work in effectiveness today is to help the people that we work with, our own organizations, our clients, to move from metrics to models, from a moment in time at which data in isolation, data in silos, data without context is pouring into their organizations in the short term, to a point at which we can reasonably say, based on good knowledge, good evidence, good modeling, which of those short-term metrics matter in the long term. What that means is that rather than saying, no, everyone wait, just wait until we've done the econometrics, wait for 6 months, wait until the proper results come in, just ignore all these lovely, pretty, shiny new metrics that are kind of coming in. Rather than saying that, we build up knowledge over time and can say, don't ignore all the metrics, don't wait 6 months for the results, but focus on these ones because these are the ones that, looking back, we know will drive success looking forward. These are the leading indicators of the success metrics that really matter to the business. And it's only once you can do that, once you can kind of move from metrics to models, when you can start to think in terms of leading indicators, that you become a successful effectiveness communicator again. That rather than being someone that can risk being seen as a blocker to effectiveness or a blocker to progress and conversation around data, is someone that can help see through the clutter, help find the signal beyond the noise. All of which is very well if you have yourself got loads and loads of time to sit there working out the leading indicators that drive your business. And just in case any of you don't, because it's quite a lengthy task, this is the reason why days like today are important and why the work that you'll see today is of such importance. Because actually, just as we shouldn't focus on isolated short-term metrics, so we shouldn't necessarily think of our own businesses and our own situations as being that isolated. I said at the start that a lot of effectiveness doesn't change. A lot of effectiveness is consistent. A lot of the way in which people respond to advertising is true for one brand or another, for one category or another. There are variations within that we need to understand, and that's important. But actually what we need is not just data, it's knowledge. And the ability to have a good working knowledge of effectiveness, a theory of how advertising works, some knowledge of how we can likely expect it to work before we start measuring our own individual case, is hugely important, because otherwise you have to do things before you can measure them. You're only ever looking backwards. Whereas what events like today let us do is look outwards. They let us look out and see what is the evidence from the industry, what are the norms, what are the generalizations, so that we can set reasonable expectations about how short-term effects will lead to long-term effects, about how the metrics that we measure today will convert into the metrics that matter tomorrow. So events like this are, and data like the stuff you'll see today in slides, hopefully more informative than the ones I've shown you, help us do that, help us make that leap between our own situation and those of others, between the short term and the long term. And this matters largely because, particularly for those of us who serve advertisers in one sense or another, be that as agencies or as publishers or as consultants or in any other context, there is an increasing expectation that we should be knowledge businesses as well as providers of a service. That all of us should have a point of view on the effectiveness of what we do and the likely effect that we will get. Because we are living in this time of complexity, that is a pressure as much felt by advertisers, by our clients, as it is by ourselves. And they look to us as people that provide communication services of one kind or another to help them resolve those questions, to get to a reasonable first step, a reasonable first set of assumptions about how something will work. I think that pressure is increasing. That demand for us all to be knowledge businesses is important. And that's why days like this are important, because it lets us all benefit from knowledge that looks well beyond just what we can see on our own, and to norms and to benchmarks and to the relationship between the short and the long term. So in about 8 words and 9 pictures, I hope I've kind of started to set the scene for what should hopefully be a much more informative rest of the day. But I'd urge you to bear that context in mind, that we are, first of all, talking into a more complex world. We're talking into a crowd rather than talking into a vacuum. And second, that we are expected to help our clients move from metrics to models and from data to knowledge. Thank you very much. Enjoy the rest of the day.